I just got a phone call. And it was like, I think it was like that for everyone. It was just so horrific. You couldn't take it in, and I couldn't take it in.
When people think of Paul McCartney, they usually picture a legend with a warm smile and timeless songs. But behind that image lies a man of deep sensitivity, someone profoundly vulnerable to criticism. In a rare moment of candor, McCartney once revealed the existence of a personal blacklist, a group of people he has despised for life. Among them, a soulmate who betrayed him for the sake of a woman, a music icon bold enough to strip him of his songs, a deranged killer, and a cunning financial fox who helped drag the legendary band to collapse. Who were these figures? And why did McCartney wait so long to finally speak of them? Paul McCartney was born in 1942 into a working-class family. Tragedy struck when his mother died of breast cancer while he was only 14. The loss carved a lasting scar, but it also ignited his passion for music, a way to heal through melody. Then, in 1957, fate brought Paul face-to-face with John Lennon. They quickly grew close, and together with George Harrison and Ringo Starr, formed the legendary band, the Beatles. Within the group, Paul played bass, sang lead vocals, and was one of the band's two primary songwriters. Over the next 6 decades, Paul McCartney not only became a world-renowned musician, but also rose to be one of the richest figures in the music industry, with an estimated fortune exceeding $1 billion. In 1997, he was knighted by the Queen of England. Yet behind that dazzling success lay darker shadows. Paul McCartney was infamous for being difficult, a relentless perfectionist who often forced the band to re-record a passage dozens of times. His strictness gave birth to immortal masterpieces, but it also fueled growing resentment. George Harrison once stormed out in anger, while John Lennon openly mocked Paul in his biting track "How Do You Sleep?" McCartney never hid his ambition. He wanted to be seen as equal to, if not greater than, Lennon. That ambition earned him a reputation for arrogance and calculation. If Lennon was the dreamer and the rebel, McCartney was the pragmatist, obsessed with business and music rights. This practical side gave him a career that endured for decades, but it also made him a thorn in the side of many fellow musicians. To the public, Paul McCartney has always been the friendly Beatle. But behind the spotlight, he is a man deeply sensitive and painfully vulnerable to criticism. At times, he sank into depression, drowned himself in alcohol, and felt so broken that he couldn't even bring himself to write music. Those wounds made him close himself off, almost never mentioning personal conflicts for decades. But recently, in a candid conversation with the press, McCartney admitted for the first time that he actually had a list of famous faces he hated to the core. That list, as he said, was the scars that never healed in his life. And the first name, Michael Jackson, a betrayal from the little brother he once trusted. In the early 1980s, Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson were an unlikely but extremely close pair of friends. They talked and collaborated frequently, and quickly became close. At that time, McCartney considered Michael a younger brother, while Jackson considered Paul a senior to follow in the music industry. In a private conversation, McCartney shared with Michael the secret to success: invest in song copyright. He said he had bought the rights to many other musicians' works, which provided him with a steady income. Michael Jackson would, to no one's surprise, put that advice into action, but in a way that shocked McCartney to the core. In 1985, ATV Music, which owned most of the Beatles' music rights, was put up for sale. At the height of his career, Michael Jackson had the wealth and decided to make his move. For about $47.5 million, he officially acquired the massive catalog of Beatles songs. For McCartney, it was nothing less than a stab in the back. he felt utterly betrayed, knowing it was he who had once advised Michael to invest in song copyrights. Never in his wildest dreams did he expect the king of pop to use that advice to seize the very legacy of the Beatles. That tense deal shattered their friendship. Later, when Jackson faced financial troubles, many assumed he would sell the Beatles' catalog back to McCartney. But that never happened. Instead, Jackson partnered with Sony, holding on to the rights for many years to come. To McCartney, it became one of the greatest mistakes of his life. A friendship once beautiful had turned into lasting bitterness. McCartney never forgave Michael Jackson. In later interviews, he admitted bluntly that he felt betrayed. "I thought we were friends." But then Michael turned it all into a business deal. The betrayal from Michael Jackson ended a beautiful friendship, but it was only the beginning of the deep cracks in Paul McCartney's life. Because if Jackson was a shock, the next name was pure heartbreak, a brotherhood that collapsed into a public feud for the whole world to see. That name was John Lennon. From soulmate to sworn rival, live on television. Paul McCartney and John Lennon were once kindred spirits, co-writing more than 200 timeless songs together. The Lennon-McCartney formula became legendary, even though in truth many songs were primarily written by just one of them. But by the mid-1960s, the distance between the two began to grow. Lennon despised the polished, sweet image McCartney was cultivating, while Paul grew increasingly frustrated with Lennon's reckless lifestyle. When Brian Epstein, the Beatles' financial manager, suddenly passed away, the band spiraled into chaos. McCartney wanted to keep the group moving forward with serious ambition and creativity. Lennon, on the other hand, was restless, eager to break free from the Beatles and find his true self alongside Yoko Ono. This clash of visions sparked endless arguments. McCartney pushed to control the band's musical direction, while Lennon accused him of being an artistic dictator. At one point, George Harrison even walked out of a recording session, unable to endure Paul's relentless demands. The conflict reached its breaking point when the Beatles finally split. It was McCartney who took the initiative, suing the other members in court to dissolve Apple Corps. To Lennon, this was nothing short of betrayal. In 1971, Lennon released the song "How Do You Sleep?" on his album Imagine. In it, he launched a direct attack on McCartney with the biting line, "The only thing you done was yesterday," mocking Paul's reliance on his famous hit Yesterday. The words cut Paul deeply. For years, McCartney spoke of the song with lingering bitterness, admitting how painful it was to hear Lennon sing those words. In return, Paul fired back with "Too Many People," a track that carried veiled jabs at Lennon and Yoko, including the lyric, "You took your lucky break and broke it in two." But fate can be cruel. The insults echoed on, while any chance of reconciliation slowly slipped away. And before McCartney could ever utter a word of forgiveness, a gunshot in New York silenced Lennon forever, closing the last door to peace between them. The third name on McCartney's blacklist, Mark David Chapman, the man who murdered Lennon, and with one act, severed all possibility of a Beatles reunion. On December 8, 1980, a dark cloud fell over New York City when John Lennon was assassinated right in front of the Dakota Building, where he lived with Yoko Ono. The killer was Mark David Chapman, a 25-year-old former Beatles fan with a disturbed mind and a twisted obsession with Lennon. That morning, Chapman quietly lingered outside. When Lennon left for the recording studio, Chapman approached him with a copy of Double Fantasy and asked for an autograph. John smiled, signed it, and walked away, completely unaware that only hours later, the same hand would pull the trigger. Around 10 p.m., when Lennon and Yoko returned home, Chapman was waiting in the shadows. As John stepped toward the doorway, Chapman pulled out a revolver and fired 5 shots into his back. Blood stained the steps of the Dakota. Lennon collapsed in Yoko's arms, only able to whisper, "I've been shot." Meanwhile, Chapman stood motionless, opened his copy of The Catcher in the Rye, and calmly waited for police to arrest him. When news of Lennon's death reached Paul McCartney, he was in shock. As he left the recording studio, reporters swarmed him, thrusting microphones in his face and shouting, "Paul, what do you think about John being shot?" Overwhelmed and fighting back tears, Paul muttered a short, awkward phrase, "It's a drag." Those 3 words immediately set off a media storm. Headlines accused McCartney of being cold and unfeeling about Lennon's death. Fans were furious, some even suggesting Paul was gloating. But the truth was far more complicated. The wounds between Lennon and McCartney had never healed. Lennon had written songs mocking Paul, while McCartney often complained of being belittled by John. Yet, despite all the tension, Paul still considered Lennon his one true creative brother. That's why Lennon's death was more than the loss of a friend. It was the death of their final chance to reconcile. In a later interview, McCartney admitted bitterly, Mark Chapman didn't just kill John. He stole a piece of the Beatles' soul. He ended any hope we had of ever sitting down together again. For decades, McCartney refused to say Chapman's name in any normal way. He would only call him a coward, a damned psycho. Every time the Beatles were honored, Paul felt the same pain, that the image of the 4 of them together now existed only in memory, never to return. The most heartbreaking part? Just weeks before his death, Lennon had begun talking about possibly working with Paul again. They had once called each other, speaking warmly like old times. But all of that ended on the night of December 8th. McCartney carried that pain for the rest of his life. And Chapman became the name he hated to the core. Yet if Chapman was the man who pulled the trigger, there was another name, a shadow that loomed over every debate about the Beatles' breakup. Someone seen both as a victim and a culprit. And for McCartney, the one he despised the most. The 4th name, Yoko Ono, the woman behind the fracture of a brotherhood. Before 1968, the Beatles' recording studio was almost a sacred sanctuary. But when John Lennon brought Yoko Ono to sit beside him during every recording session, the atmosphere instantly changed. Yoko was known for her strong personality and her desire to control everything around Lennon. For Paul McCartney, a perfectionist and strict taskmaster, this was unbearable. He saw Yoko's interference in their songwriting and direct involvement in musical discussions as an invasion. Paul once admitted, "I don't resent Yoko for being with John, but I hated the way things changed once she appeared." Many researchers believe this was the moment when the Lennon-McCartney partnership began to crack. After the Beatles broke up, McCartney often hinted that Yoko was to blame. In interviews, he repeatedly stated that John was never the same once he was with her. From the late 1960s onward, Lennon's artistic and personal decisions were directly influenced by his wife. On her side, Yoko Ono was never shy about attacking Paul McCartney. Openly ambitious, she saw her relationship with Lennon not just as love, but as a union to elevate both of their names. She once claimed that Lennon was the true creative soul, while Paul was merely good at writing catchy melodies. Those words cut straight into McCartney's pride, the pride of a man who spent his entire life seeking recognition as Lennon's equal. And one of the greatest sources of conflict between Paul and Yoko was over song copyrights. By the original agreement, all Beatles songs were credited as Lennon-McCartney, regardless of who the main writer was. After Lennon's death, Yoko became determined to defend John's legacy. When McCartney suggested switching some credits to McCartney-Lennon, she fiercely objected. Paul insisted he only wanted to correct the historical record, but Yoko saw it as an attempt to erase John. This dispute dragged on for decades, spilling across headlines and courtrooms. McCartney once declared bluntly, "She wants to rewrite history in a way that favors her and John, but I can't let that happen." In response, Yoko often dismissed Paul's music as simplistic, claiming that compared to John's work, it was nothing more than hollow entertainment. In 1981, during a Rolling Stone poll, Yoko even voted Paul as the least important Beatle. That insult drove their relationship even further apart. It wasn't until the late 1990s, when McCartney took part in the Anthology project and helped re-release old Beatles recordings, that the two made small gestures toward reconciliation. But the distrust never fully faded. In one interview, Paul admitted with bitterness, "I don't hate Yoko, but if it weren't for her, maybe the Beatles could have stayed together a few more years." Yet the feud with Yoko wasn't the only scar. Inside the band itself, a quiet younger brother once rose in defiance, leaving Paul with a wound in his career he would never forget. Number 5, George Harrison, a brutal conflict in the studio. Paul McCartney and George Harrison often clashed over their working styles. In the studio, Paul was an extreme perfectionist, frequently ordering Harrison to play his parts exactly the way Paul envisioned, even dictating individual guitar notes. Harrison was a gifted guitarist, but as a songwriter he was overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney. This left him feeling increasingly sidelined. During the recording of Let It Be, Paul repeatedly demanded that Harrison replay the same section over and over until George finally snapped, walking out of the studio in frustration, leaving the rest of the band stunned. And it wasn't an isolated incident. Across multiple albums, many of the carefully crafted guitar solos Harrison composed were either rejected or altered by McCartney. To Harrison, this was a humiliation, reducing him to a background figure in the very band he helped create. He often complained that Paul never listened to his ideas. Even on later records, several of Harrison's original songs were cast aside. What George wanted most was recognition, not just as the Beatles' lead guitarist, but as a true songwriter in his own right. Although Paul and George maintained outward politeness, Harrison never hid his frustration. In one interview, he bluntly remarked, "Working with Paul is like having your hands tied. He always thinks he knows everything." Their disagreements didn't end with the Beatles' breakup. The two continued clashing in bitter legal disputes over Apple Corps' copyrights. The truth was, harmony between them had never really existed. McCartney, obsessed with control, and Harrison, desperate to be recognized as an independent artist, were opposites that could never truly reconcile. For George, Paul's domineering approach turned him from a loyal Beatle into a quiet rebel. But personal clashes were only a fragment of the storm. The real fracture came from outside, an ambitious businessman who stepped in during the Beatles' most vulnerable moment. 6. Alan Klein, the manipulator behind the Beatles' downfall. In 1967, after the sudden death of manager Brian Epstein, the Beatles were thrown into turmoil. All four were brilliant musicians, but none had the skill or knowledge to manage the vast empire they had built. At that time, the Beatles' ventures had exploded: Apple Films, Apple Corps, a recording studio, a boutique store, and a growing roster of artists under contract. Yet behind the glitter, everything was chaos, and money was draining away. Into this crisis walked Alan Klein. Already known for managing the Rolling Stones and Sam Cooke, Klein had earned a reputation as a fierce defender of artists against record company exploitation. He presented himself as the savior the Beatles needed, promising to rebuild order and make them wealthier than ever. From the start, Paul McCartney distrusted him. To Paul, Klein's charm was nothing more than a mask. His smooth words reeked of deceit. McCartney instead pushed for the Beatles to work with Eastman and Eastman, the law firm run by Linda McCartney's family, whose integrity he trusted. But John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr thought differently. Lennon was particularly taken by Klein, admiring his bluntness and no-nonsense attitude. Harrison and Starr, meanwhile, dismissed Paul's concerns as selfishness, believing he was merely trying to put his in-laws in charge. In 1969, the three Beatles, Lennon, Harrison, and Starr, signed with Klein as their official manager. McCartney refused. Furious, he knew that from that moment onward, he would be isolated in financial decisions, outnumbered 3-1. Klein wasted no time in reshaping Apple Corps. He fired staff, slashed projects, and, at least on the surface, managed to boost profits for the Beatles. But McCartney wasn't convinced. To him, it was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. He believed Klein was siphoning money behind the band's back. Then, on December 31, 1970, Paul McCartney made a move that shocked the world. He sued his fellow Beatles. The lawsuit wasn't only about dissolving the group, it was also aimed at cutting ties with Alan Klein. When the news broke, Paul McCartney sues John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. The backlash was immediate. Fans branded Paul as the traitor, the man who destroyed the Beatles. In truth, McCartney was fighting to free himself from Klein's grip. And time would prove him right. Just a few years later, Klein was exposed for financial misconduct, taking inflated commissions, withholding artists' royalties, and even facing prosecution for tax evasion. By 1977, he was ordered to repay the Beatles over $800,000. Lennon, Harrison, and Starr eventually admitted, bitterly, that Paul's suspicions had been justified. But by then, it was too late. The Beatles were finished, beyond saving. In later interviews, McCartney never softened his words. He called Klein a con man, the man who legally and financially dismantled the Beatles. And he never forgave the others for siding with him. Klein may have ended the Beatles with contracts and numbers on paper. But as their story closed, another hand appeared, this one far more ruthless, leaving scars in music itself. 7. Phil Spector, the producer who ruined Let It Be. By 1970, the Beatles were crumbling. Paul's dream for the Get Back project, a raw, stripped-down return to their roots, had collapsed into endless bickering in the studio. Then came the final insult. Alan Klein, the man Paul already despised, brought in Phil Spector to salvage the recordings. Spector was famous for his wall of sound, a dense, overwhelming flood of instruments that sounded like an orchestra colliding head-on. But for McCartney, this was the exact opposite of what he wanted. His ballad The Long and Winding Road was meant to be intimate, fragile, almost like a sigh. When Spector got hold of it, Paul's song was buried under layers of strings, brass, and a women's choir. To make room, some of McCartney's original vocals were even erased. When Paul heard the mix, he was furious. He fired off a letter to Klein and Spector, sharp, restrained, but seething, "Get the strings, the brass, the choir, and all that noise off my song." It was his way of screaming, "You've insulted me. You've insulted my music." His plea was ignored. In May 1970, Let It Be was released, with Spector's heavy-handed production. The album went to the top of the charts, but for Paul it was a hollow victory. Instead of triumph, he saw betrayal carved into vinyl. Even George Martin, the Beatles' longtime producer, condemned it. This album should read, produced by George Martin and ruined by Phil Spector. Spector himself was unapologetic, if anything, defiant. He boasted that McCartney had been performing his mix 4 decades and even won an Oscar with Let It Be. If he wants a war, Spector sneered, he picked the wrong opponent. For McCartney, it was a wound that never healed. For decades, he spoke of it as proof of the cracks and betrayals that tore the Beatles apart. But more than 30 years later, Paul finally had his revenge. In 2003, Paul McCartney finally took back what he felt had been stolen from him. He released Let It Be. Naked, a stripped-down version of the album that erased every trace of Phil Spector's grandiose editions. The long and winding road was restored to its original form, bare, fragile, just piano and voice, exactly as Paul had intended. For him, this wasn't just another release. It was a statement of ownership, a declaration to the world, this is my song. No one has the right to corrupt it. Let It Be. That album gave McCartney a sense of justice, but even as his musical wounds began to heal, another blow came, this time not from the studio, but from the stage of America. 8. Frank Sinatra, the man who mocked yesterday and insulted the Beatles. At first, there was no animosity. To Paul, Sinatra represented a golden age of romance and elegance in music, an era he deeply admired. Despite belonging to different worlds, there was once a quiet respect between them. But cracks soon formed. Sinatra openly dismissed rock and roll, sneering that it was nothing but garbage for rebellious kids. For McCartney, who had carried the Beatles on the tidal wave of rock and roll across the globe, those words stung like ice water. It wasn't just criticism. It was a rejection of an entire generation. The conflict reached its peak when Sinatra mocked Yesterday, one of McCartney's most cherished creations. In front of an audience, he called it the saddest song ever written and even ridiculed its melody. To Paul, it was a dagger to the heart. And Sinatra didn't stop there. At one performance, he introduced George Harrison's Something by saying, "Here's the greatest love song Lennon and McCartney ever wrote." What sounded harmless to the audience erased Harrison's authorship and left Paul seething with frustration. To him, it was proof that Sinatra never truly respected the Beatles, not as artists, but as those boys who made loud music.